In the wider community, we should just be thinking about dust basically as asbestos.
Most people think that dust is something that happens if they were exposed to something in the 1960s during the course of work, but that ain't necessarily so.
There might be wider concepts, but in day-to-day usage we have to understand that it's what happens with asbestos when it breaks down and that it can be consumed, and we consume it through our breathing passages. The nature of the workplace has changed, so it can be in someone's home where you have tradesmen come and go, and it can be in multi-storey buildings.
It doesn't necessarily have to have been contracted during the course of employment, but contracted during the course of either building a house or even if a person's been exposed whilst visiting premises.
So workers can bring it home in their clothing, and there have been reported cases of family members having the exposure to asbestos through washing of the clothing.
The way dust diseases were dealt with originally was through the Supreme Court. I think there was a gradual appreciation as time went on that perhaps things weren't getting dealt with as they should in a dust diseases case, because it's got specific requirements and specific issues that are uncommon to a lot of other personal injury cases.
We've learned that it essentially has a very long gestation period. It's not like being hit by a train.
You've got to go outside of your 9 to 5 existence to run these cases, because they do require an extra bit of effort, an extra bit of research into areas that haven't been dealt with in other cases in the tribunal before.
So we really need to think about it as understanding virtually every construction site before 1975 has got a real risk of having dust involved in it.
There are certain court documents that are required during the course of a standard dust case that are unique to the Dust Diseases Tribunal. There are processes such as an issues and listing conference that don't take place anymore elsewhere in other jurisdictions. The critical thing is getting someone who knows this area and take a proper statement of exposure over a period of time. That can be a very difficult task in this area because we're dealing with someone's whole employment history potentially. That can be particularly complex, for instance, if a person's been a smoker at the same time as he or she may have been exposed to asbestos. And it's very critical to get that exact timeline worked out at an early stage, because all the evidence is really dependent on how long the person was exposed to the particular dust and what type of dust.
One of the places where it's found to have a very long-term and debilitating legacy is in power generation. It was used extensively for what was described as lagging in power plants. So historically you've had a lot of what we'll call power workers exposed to it.
The way they operate down there at the tribunal is largely dependent on what type of a case you're bringing, and the mesothelioma cases have got a specific way of being dealt with which is special to them. They are dealt with on an expedited basis, and that enables, for instance, cases such as where there is a dire prognosis for evidence to be taken at the bedside and on a very urgent basis and 7 days a week.
The vast majority of the people who I've seen over the years come to ask not in their own interest but in concern for their families. If they've been the breadwinner, if they've cared for their family and they still want to have that role, they don't want to be a burden. They want to know what their rights are so they can ease the burden on their loved ones.
It's critical to have some appreciation of what these people are being through. They're not just numbers, they're people who've really been through a terrible scenario through no fault of their own over a number of years.
It's really a situation where we need to think about whether there's been a duty of care and a breach of duty of care. It should be part of every risk assessment that takes place when you're doing building work. It should be part of every risk assessment when you're undertaking even gardening, landscape gardening. Are there pipes that have been laid that are asbestos based? Are we going to be cutting that pipe? What are we going to be doing? How are we going to manage the risk? And how are we going to manage the risk not just for the workers who are there but for the wider community?
The reality is that even in the modern day there are lots of houses out there that are undergoing perhaps not professional renovation, and you just need to have those safeguards in place, because if you drill or if you saw a piece of asbestos, you're at risk and your family's at risk. So that the safeguards do have to be taken even now.
How often do we know in our own lives of people renovating their homes while they live in the home? How often do we know in our own lives when we come back to a house when there's building rubble and material left after the work's been done? You can be replacing a roof or a garage wall. It can be replete with asbestos-related products. And if it's not dismantled the right way, with the right care and expertise, there'll be an exposure. And that's where your family live, and that's where the children next door live.
I think it's a sad indictment of what's happened in history, that asbestos was allowed to be the cause of such wide exposure over any number of people.
We're always talking about what will happen if I'm gone. What are my possible rights? Do I have to do something sooner rather than later? My wife's anxious. How do we address it? So we try and involve the whole family in understanding what the possible outcomes will be.
I think they say that the potential intubation period is about 40 to 50 years. Well, if that's correct, then hopefully most cases in another 20 years won't be there anymore.
We just cannot leave asbestos sheeting sitting in an ordinary waste disposal station. It needs to be properly wrapped and quarantined and then isolated so it doesn't come back to haunt us again in 50 or 80 years.